The Love Spell. Episode 2: The Price of Desire. Langton's heart was heavy as he replayed the events of the previous evening in his mind. Betty's harsh words and the sting of her slap lingered in his thoughts, but more than the physical pain, it was the realization of how much he had hurt her that tormented him. He had underestimated her strength and resolve, mistaking her quiet nature for vulnerability. Now, he was more determined than ever to win her trust, even if it meant changing his ways. Days turned into weeks, and Langton kept his distance from Betty, respecting her wish for solitude. He watched her from afar, noticing the subtle details of her routine and the grace with which she carried herself. Each morning, she left for work at the same time, dressed in modest yet elegant clothing. In the evenings, she returned, often with a small bag of groceries or a book tucked under her arm. Her life was a model of simplicity and discipline. Langton, on the other hand, began to reassess his own life. He distanced himself from his numerous girlfriends and cut back on his reckless behavior. He spent more time at his shop, engaging with customers and managing the business with newfound dedication. His friends noticed the change in him and often teased him about it, but Langton took their jests in stride. He knew that if he wanted any chance with Betty, he needed to prove himself worthy. One rainy afternoon, as Langton was closing up his shop, he noticed a commotion at the far end of the market. Curious, he walked over to see what was happening. A small crowd had gathered around an elderly woman who had collapsed on the ground. Langton pushed his way through the crowd and saw that it was Mrs. Ngoma, a well-known herbalist in the village. "Someone call for help," Langton shouted, kneeling beside the woman. He checked her pulse and found it weak but steady. "She's been feeling unwell for days," a young woman from the crowd said. "She refuses to see a doctor." Without hesitation, Langton scooped Mrs. Ngoma into his arms and carried her to his car. He drove to the nearest clinic, where the doctors took her in for examination. Langton waited anxiously in the reception area, hoping she would be okay. After what felt like hours, a doctor approached him. "She's stable now," the doctor said. It seems she was suffering from severe exhaustion and dehydration. "She'll need to rest and take her medication regularly." Relieved, Langton thanked the doctor and went to see Mrs. Ngoma. She was lying on a hospital bed, looking frail but conscious. She smiled weakly when she saw him. "Thank you, young man," she whispered. "You've done a great kindness for me today." "It's the least I could do, Mama," Langton replied, taking her hand. "You need to take better care of yourself." Mrs. Ngoma nodded and closed her eyes, slipping into a peaceful sleep. Langton stayed by her side until she was discharged from the hospital the next day. He drove her back to her home and made sure she was comfortable before leaving. Word of Langton's good deeds spread quickly through the village, and many people began to see him in a new light. Among them was Betty, who heard about it from a colleague at work. She was surprised but also impressed by his selflessness. She couldn't deny that there was more to Langton than she had initially thought. One evening, as Betty was returning home, she saw Langton in the courtyard, tending to a small garden he had started. She hesitated for a moment, then approached him. "Good evening, Langton," she greeted him softly. Langton looked up, surprised but pleased to see her. "Good evening, Betty. How are you?" "I'm fine, thank you. I heard about what you did for Mrs. Ngoma." "That was very kind of you." Langton smiled modestly. "It was nothing. She needed help, and I was there." Betty nodded, her eyes searching his for a moment. "I misjudged you, Langton. I thought you were just a reckless womanizer, but you've shown that you have a good heart." Langton's heart swelled with hope. "Thank you, Betty. I know I haven't been the best person, but I'm trying to change. I want to be someone you can trust." Betty studied him for a moment longer before nodding. I believe you, Langton. But trust takes time to build. I understand, Langton replied earnestly. I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. With a small smile, Betty turned and walked towards her cottage. Langton watched her go, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt that he was on the right path. Over the next few weeks, Langton continued to make changes in his life. He spent more time at his shop, building a reputation as a reliable and trustworthy businessman. He also began to volunteer at the local community center, helping with various projects and initiatives. His efforts did not go unnoticed, and gradually, the villagers began to see him as a changed man. One Saturday afternoon, the village held its annual harvest festival, a time of celebration and thanksgiving. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and music, and the aroma of delicious food wafted through the streets. Langton decided to attend, hoping to see Betty there. As he walked through the festival grounds, he spotted Betty with a group of children, helping them with a craft project. She looked radiant, her smile lighting up her face as she interacted with the kids. Langton's heart skipped a beat at the sight of her. Summoning his courage, he approached her. Hello, Betty. Betty looked up and smiled. Hello, Langton. Enjoying the festival? Very much so, he replied. Would you like to take a walk with me? Betty hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right. They strolled through the festival grounds, chatting about various things. Langton shared stories from his past, and Betty talked about her work and her dreams for the future. As they walked, they came across a fortune teller's tent. Langton, feeling playful, suggested they go inside. The fortune teller, an elderly woman with piercing eyes, greeted them warmly. She studied their palms and told them that they were destined for great things, but only if they worked together. Langton and Betty exchanged amused glances but thanked the woman for her insights. After leaving the tent, they continued their walk, eventually finding a quiet spot by the river. They sat down on a bench, and Langton took a deep breath. Betty, I know I've made many mistakes in my life, but I want to be a better man. For you, and for myself. Will you give me a chance to prove that I've changed? Betty looked at him, her eyes soft and thoughtful. Langton, I've seen the changes you've made. You're not the same man you were before. But trust is something that takes time. I'm willing to see where this goes, but we need to take it one step at a time. Langton nodded, a smile spreading across his face. I understand. Thank you, Betty. That means a lot to me. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the village, Langton and Betty sat together, talking and laughing. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with hope and the promise of a brighter future. To be continued, so kindly comment, like and subscribe to watch the next episode, and if you missed the previous episode, kindly click on the display episode above or check the description section of this video.